Hello, everybody. Can you hear me in the back? All right. So thanks for having me today. My name is John Woodell, and I do various things at Google internally. I'm probably the only person that's ever been hired to work on Rails apps exclusively internally, although there are other people lurking around there that do it. I'm here today to tell you about running Rails and JRuby on AppEngine. But instead of doing a normal presentation, I'm going to basically just kind of walk through how I would work on the app and the development environment as if I were sitting down with you, showing you how it works. So show of hands, how many folks have done something at all in AppEngine, even with Python? All right, so JRuby AppEngine, anybody? Yeah, so anyone care to share their experiences? Good, bad, ugly?
Actually, it was pretty simple with the JRuby, the AppEngine gems and stuff that come with they can give for JRails. The main experience was using the data stores.
Right. Okay, so AppEngine will support SQL backend as part of AppEngine for Business. That's something that's for trusted testers currently. And I think that makes a lot of sense for folks that have mail, calendar, domain, and they're building apps, and they want to also build kind of enterprise apps that have a relational database, and there's not a huge challenge for scaling the application. The secret sauce of AppEngine is really the data store, and it's a great way to experiment with a NoSQL backend. So if you're going into AppEngine saying, I want to take a Rails app that has a relational database and force it in there, you can do it, but that's not necessarily the best way to approach it. I think the best way is to just kind of build something simple and learn how it works and kind of embrace the data store. Because the data store is actually very scalable, and the way the app instances come up is very scalable. So if you want to build an app that you don't want to worry about scaling, the data store will help you do that. Okay, so recently, in January, I guess in late December, there was a release of AppEngine 1.4.1. And some folks like to think of it as AppEngine 2.0 in that the initial version of AppEngine was designed so that you would build very simple servlets or like CGIs, and you could spin new instances up quickly, and there's not a lot of work to do. If you want to run any kind of fat framework, whether it's Spring or Rails, you're going to have to initialize that, and that takes some time. So AppEngine initially wasn't designed to handle that, but the new version of AppEngine is. And I'm going to just show you what that looks like in the console. You guys can see that. So I have this app here that's set to always on, and I believe that's around $9 a month. You can put your app up. You have this minimal fee, and those instances sit there. In this case, they're doing nothing at all. And this is Rails primer. So if I just hit this little Rails properties page here a few times and I go back, I can see that there's some traffic hitting each of those instances. When the traffic gets to a certain point and AppEngine predicts you might need another instance, it will warm that up and roll it in. And you only pay for those, the fourth and the fifth and the sixth instances as you have traffic. There is a cost of the CPU to spin up that instance. Let's say it takes 12 seconds or whatever. So it's going to leave that fourth instance up for quite a while until it spins it back down. So you're not paying for the fourth to be coming up and down a lot. If you have a traditional AppEngine app where you have very small servlets, they can spin up and spin down, and there's very little cost associated with that. If you have a traditional AppEngine app where you don't have this always on, I'll go down here to this one here. You'll just see that there's nothing happening. There's no instances running. And if I reload, it's going to take maybe 12 seconds or something for one instance to fire up. And so when you're doing development with Rails, you'll run into that, and it seems a little bit odd that you have to wait so long. But one will come up, and there it is. And I can now hit on it a bunch. And if I reload it, I'll see now I have one, and this is a dynamic instance. and it has some very extreme latency there, obviously. So, and that's just basically calculating the fact that it had to spin up. Okay, so I'm going to now show you how you would go about just building an app to test. And the best place to start is on this website here. We also have the blog, and that's at JRuby-AppEngineblogspot.com. And every time I have a new release, I'll post what the release has in it, and maybe I'll post some sort of new demo that is showing something. A couple years ago, when we started talking about this, well, over a year ago, there were a lot of gems that, like Nokagiri wasn't even close to being able to run, but at this point it does. And even though you might find that a lot of the apps you build today on a traditional MRI platform, you have a lot of gems in the server like ImageMagick or something like that, or RMagick. You're going to want to have AppEngine take care of the image processing with its own image framework. And so you're really just using a smaller set of gems that are inside the app itself, inside the server container. And I don't think people are going to really find the gems being compatible with JRuby as a big issue. I think a bigger challenge for folks is going to be thinking about building Rails apps with the data store, as someone pointed out. So if you're on this page here, which is our blog, it links back to the project on project hosting. There's a sample Sinatra app here, and the main page has links to various things. One of them is this Rails 2.3.10 demo. And I didn't click on it there. And it's just a gist that describes how that works. I'm going to go through that in a second. But the other thing I'll just show you is that if I want to quickly run a little application, I need to install the Google AppEngine gem, which I've already done. And I might type appconfig.rb . So we created a generate app command that's not part of the Java or Python app engine that just sets up a sample application for you that's a rack application. And so what it's doing now is it created a gem file, and it then created brought down the gems that I needed and packaged everything up. So hopefully you guys can see this. Did I lose that there? So since it's just a rack application, I need rack. I'm going to need JRuby Rack so that I can run rack inside a server container. The AppEngine Rack gem is just our listener, our servlet listener that we want to install. And you'll notice that there's these jar files that it installed down here. Can everybody see this okay? It's kind of low. So let's take a look at that to see what's going on there. Okay, so I have a gem file which looks like this. If I wanted to use a specific version of JRuby, I would just specify JRuby-jars and then some version of JRuby I want. Unlike doing JRuby development that you might do with Warbler, we're not running inside of JRuby and then running Mongrel inside of JRuby. We're running inside of MRI to use rake files and use Ruby to do the tooling. But we're just running an application server, Java application server, and the version of JRuby you want is just specified as a gem. So you don't have to install JRuby and then work inside that version. If you want to roll up or down to any version of JRuby, you just specify here. And then I see that I probably have a config RU, and it said this hello. So if I run this, I'm going to run dev AppServer. It's going to start this AppServer, and the AppServer is the AppServer in there. It's on port 80. Let's take a look at that. I should have minimized that probably. There, here we go. Hello there. So the app server that we are running is the app server that is created as part of AppEngine for Java. So that's available as a gem. So every time there's a new Java SDK, I grab it, I download it, I run a rake file, it creates a gem, and I publish it. And that's really all I do. Part of it goes into this gem called AppEngine APIs, and that's so that when your app is running, there's a gem that you can put in your gem file that has the APIs available to your running app. But the other piece is really this application server and all of these things that you need to run the Java application server. But you don't have to install that separately. Yes?
So how do those APIs work in development running on your own machine? Like how do you use the data store?
Right. So, okay. So I mentioned earlier that if you run Warbler, you're running inside of JRuby, and then you're running Mongrel or something. In this case, the application is a valid servlet, and you're running the AppEngine for Java app server. That app server is available from Google and has all of those APIs stubbed out. So it has a user API, a URL fetch, data store. All those APIs are available, but you have to be running inside a server container. Otherwise, every time there's a new SDK, we have to do a bunch of work to recreate all these APIs. So the difference with this development environment compared to a traditional Warbler or JRuby is they're running Mongrel, and then when they decide to go to production, they create this WAR file, which is something that didn't exist, and then publish it. In our case, if we ran that way, we wouldn't have any of the APIs. So you'd be developing the app, you could create a Rails app, but you wouldn't be able to talk to the data store or get any APIs, so it would be quite useless. So that's why the tools make it so critical. Now I'm going to kill out of this here. Okay, so let's take a look again what we have here. So inside the WebInf, I have this lib directory. I ended up with these jar files. And again, I just want to make sure you guys can see this. So AppEngine Rack jar is a jar that is part of the AppEngine Rack gem. And whenever you touch the gem file or don't have a gem file, the tools that we've created, app config RB and dev AppServer RB, they look at the gem file, they realize you've made a change, they run a older fork of bundler, they create this gems jar file, and they put all of your gems inside that one jar file. And along the way, if they find any jar file inside of a gem, it gets dropped into the WebInf lib. So in an AppServer WebInf lib, if you put a jar file in there, it's on your class path. And we use an older version of Bundler because originally Bundler was trying to create this system where it figures out what your load path needs to be, it generates a static file for that, and then there's no more Ruby gems at runtime. And that saves us like 4 to 6 seconds and a bunch of memory. And the idea is if you want a new instance to fire up, you want to just load this file. And I can take a look at that file. It's in this gems directory, bundler gems, JRuby, environment maybe. I can't see what's off my screen there. Let me change that a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to come down a little bit here. So this is the file that's created by Bundler08. And you'll see it's created this, this load path that finds the gems where they are. And all I need to do is require this environment file, and then all my gems are available. So at runtime, and there's also something going on here where it stubs out Ruby gems completely. So if at runtime, my app, something calls Ruby gems, nothing happens. The gems are available. The newer version of Bundler is doing a lot more than this version did, and they're working on this standalone flag, which should generate this file again. And that's supposedly going to be in Bundler 1.1 or something, and we're waiting for that. As soon as that is available, then I'll be able to have a Rails 3 version that works this way. Today, you could technically download Rails 3, run it inside of JRuby, warble it, stick it on AppEngine, and you'd have Rails 3 running on AppEngine, but your development environment wouldn't have any APIs like the data store. So there's really no point in doing that. But that should be coming real soon.
Could you just edit your gem file to be an older style gem file?
Could you edit your gem file to be on Rails 3?
Yeah.
Well, I think the problem is, so Sinatra and Rails 2.3.10 work great with this old version of Bundler because those older frameworks call Ruby gems and nothing happens. Rails 3 is talking to Bundler various times, right? It's asking Bundler to do things for it, and Bundler, this old version of Bundler doesn't even work the same way. So you could basically get Rails 3 running, I guess uninstall Bundler, and then start monkey patching to make it stop trying to talk to Bundler, and then you'd have a version of Rails 3 that no longer knows about Bundler, and you could then do this. But I think we should just let YCats make it work. I think that would be a better solution. So I don't have Rails 3 running right now, but it's very close. I think there's actually more critical environments like Heroku and other environments that people want to focus on for Rails 3, and I still have a bunch of older Rails apps that I port over to Rails 2.3.10, and that's fine for me. Okay, so I also can look and see, I've got these gems here. Let me just do this again here. So the gems that I bundle into my application get copied to this .gems area. That's the local cache. And then when it basically jars it up from that bundler gems directory. So if I go in here, jar tvf, vf. So, and this is kind of rough to see, but you see it starts from bundler gems inside the jar file. The .gems directory is my local cache, but when I require, I tell it to require from bundler gems, JRuby 1.8 gems, environment RB, and that way I load the environment file with the load paths out of the jar file, and I know that I'm always running locally out of the jar file, even though I have a local cache of these gems that I've copied into the folder. The other thing I can do here is I can go into one of these gems in this cache and mess around with it and change things, make comments, do debugging statements, and then I just remove the gems.jar file and it recreates it from this cache of the gems. And then when I'm done, I can throw away my .gems directory, refetch it. And so it's really easy to create a copy of everything that's going into the container, change it around, and experiment. So that's how a Rack app would work. And I guess I should now go off and show you how a Rails app would work here. Let's desktop. Okay. So as I was saying, there's this gist here, and what this is doing is it's taking and it really tells you everything to do. You sudo gem install Google AppEngine. Now, if you're inside of RVM, you would just create a MRI 1.8 RVM and not put sudo on there, and everything should work fine. I also ask for the version of Rails that you want to work with to be installed in MRI, because every time I bundle a new app, I'm just copying those gems over. So otherwise, you're going to have to download everything all the time. You don't want to do that. There's this Rails DM data store gem, and that gem requires, I imagine, some other gems, but it basically is the adapter that makes Rails think that data mapper is active record on AppEngine. There's a AR finders gem that if you load it in, it makes the active record calls work on data mapper. And so when I generate scaffolding, I just generate scaffolding out of active record, and it runs on data mapper. Now, it's not the most efficient way to do it, but that way you just can use an old version of Rails that knows nothing about data mapper, generate scaffolding, and have an app that's working. And then, when you go modify it, you can choose to use the active record conventions or use the data mapper API. Okay, so the most exciting piece right here. Well, first of all, I want to make a directory, and I'll do that. And then I'm going to copy this. And if you look at the script that I downloaded, it fetches some fragments of configuration files and merges them into an existing Rails app. So it fetches a gem file, and then it basically runs this app config command. It's now, you'll notice that in some cases it says caching, some cases it says downloading. When it says downloading, it means that I don't have that gem in my MRI gem cache, and that won't be possible if it's a gem that's a specific JRuby gem. If it's a gem that works in JRuby or MRI, then I can cache it locally. Otherwise, I may have to download it again. Okay, so my script created a gem file. It ran bundler. It fetched all the gems. It ran this command to generate the Rails app, and then it also stubbed out this null DB adapter. And the reason I do that is that I want to be able to run active record scaffold generation, but I don't actually want to set up a MySQL or anything. So I run the scaffold with this null DB adapter, and then I go over to using data mapper. Now, I created a little command here that will run the server. So again, I went to the blog. I went to this gist. I created a directory. I ran this one script that installed Rails 2.3.10 and patched a couple files. And then now we're waiting for it to initialize, and then now it's running. So we're on host port 8080 now. Oops, that's a little bit much. Okay, so I have a Rails app running, and you'll notice that I indicate that Ruby Gems is disabled, and I have a version of Data Mapper here, version 1.0, and this is a custom version of this info properties that I created, but it's telling you the same information plus a few things about AppEngine. I'm going to go back over to this gist. I created a few wrappers that say script server, script console, script publish, so that if you don't want to learn the AppEngine commands, you just run those and they are wrappers for those other commands. And then I'm going to now run this scaffold. I'm going to Control C out of that. I'm going to make sure I'm in the directory. I am. Okay, so this scaffold command is creating a contact scaffold with some attributes. And there it is, it's done. And if I look at the model, I have an active record model, and I guess you guys can see that.
When you're in Vim, will you set the background to dark?
So what's my Vim command that set the background to black? Oops.
Background equals dark, right?
Set background
Or BG.
BG equals dark.
That usually works.
Well, it went bold. I'm going to just go really big.
Okay.
But it's not dark. It's
Okay.
The background is light.
It's probably a terminal setting.
Okay, well, I'm going to forge ahead. I like a white background, and there we go. Okay, so the second command I have is a generator called DDModel that is in a gem I created, and that's kind of like data mapper, data store model. And there it is. And if I look at the contact model now, you'll notice that it is a data mapper model. I guess I want to go a little smaller here. So in data mapper, the schema is defined inside the model. AppEngine doesn't care if you create title as a string and then make it a text field next time you save it, and then you make it an integer. It doesn't care at all. You shove whatever you want in whenever you save, and the data store will accept it. Your Rails app, on the other hand, will freak out if it's expecting one thing and you give it something else. So something that I'll do is, I have a migrate, if I have a conversion that I want to do, you can create a map reduce. Well, you create a task that goes through and fixes it, but you might also push a version that identifies this older type schema and fixes it when it saves. And so you make sure that your model functions with the old and the new format, and then when you've cleaned up all your data, you can go through and you can peel that out. but it's not the kind of thing where you have a specific version that goes with a specific schema like you might with traditional Rails app. Okay, so I also have a couple things in here. I'm setting on string, I'm setting the length to be very large. Data mapper assumes string should be 50 unless you specify. And also text fields end up being lazy loaded by default, and that's a bad idea on AppEngine because it's coming over these protocol buffers and you just want to fetch the whole thing. I think it's actually fetched anyway, and so you might as well just grab the whole thing. Okay, so let's fire this app up. And like I said earlier, the scaffold that I generated was AR scaffold. It has find, all, things like that, as opposed to, contact.all. There's a different format. Actually, the new active record I think may even have a similar schema. So okay, it's running. So I don't actually have to worry about fixing the schema or I can use active record conventions if I need to. Okay, so there's contacts. Now, I did specify inside the configuration file that the contacts URL requires a login, and with this app I generated, mostly because I want people to realize how easy it is to specify a login required on a specific URL. And I can also tell an administrator. It will, if I say requires admin, I can check that box. So there's a new contact. If I create it, it will freak out that I haven't filled it in. So I'm going to just fill in some gibberish here. And then it will accept that data. And now I have one record filled out. Now locally, I can look at this admin, and I can browse the data on the local development server. So when you're running inside the app server, it provides you this inbound mail XMPP in the task queue, but you can also browse your data if you want to see what's going on with it. And there's the data that I put in. So that's interesting, phone number. Oh, it's showing the object. Interesting.
Did you persist that across a restart of your dev server?
So there's actually a file that's created that stores this data, and the data is persistent. Let's take a look here. So if I go into WebInf app, engine generated, local DB bin, there's a binary file that stores that, and as long as I don't change the application ID, that data is available. Someone actually created a whole demo locally, and they wanted to publish it. They changed their app ID to publish it to a real application ID, and then all the data was gone. And we realized that it works the same way locally as it does in production. If your app's called foobar, you can read the data store locally that's for app foobar. If you change your app ID to my production ID, your data has gone missing because in production you can't read someone else's data, of course. Okay, so the data is there stored locally, but it's not the kind of thing where you would push it out of that up into production. There's some tools in the Python SDK that allow you to pull data out and push data back up. And one thing I do is in the app.yaml, oops, I'm doing it wrong here, that I fetch as part of my Rails app, I create this remote API URL handler. So there are certain servlets that are available in production and are also available inside of this AppEngine AppServer that you don't have to touch, create, they're just there. So because I put this handler in, if you push this app into production, you can fetch the data out of this data store as long as you authenticate, and you can push data in, you can find entities, and you can work on it. So that's what I have to do there. You'll notice also I specified that the contacts URL has login required, and then I also specify that I want to not upload a bunch of things that I don't need on production. And then finally, I specify an expiration date of a year on all my static files because I'm going to put a stamp on the end of those, or Rails is going to do that for me. And that's the most efficient way to work. So there's my Rails app. Now, if I go into production So I've got an app here, which I'm sure has spun down. Okay, so this is a Rails app that I have that is, I built a viewer, like a file browser in it, and it's showing me what's on the file. So here's my gem file. In this case, I've told it that I want Rails 239 and OpenSSL, and I actually need to include OpenSSL if I want to have session-based cookies. Otherwise, I could use the servlet cookies, and then I have to have some kind of a script going up and cleaning those out, which is kind of a pain. So I'd much rather just let Rails do the cookies for me in the session. Yes?
This is like a totally different angle, but if you're spinning up a dev version of the like servlet container, like the API thing, to do your development environment, does that mean I have to, that anytime I want to run my specs, it has to spin up a servlet container and load in things and run specs against that and drop them back out?
Well,
in order to get the data APIs to work and test?
So that is something that you could work on, and it's not incredibly difficult. The challenge is that there are very few people doing that piece. So, for example, if I'm running the dev server and it's talking to this local data store in that file, I need to get inside of that process in order to run tests on that data store. And that's actually kind of tricky, but it's not impossible. It used to be a lot easier, and recently there's a change which makes it difficult for us to run like a console or run some sort of spec that has access to that as well. But I think the new version of Bundler will make that a lot easier. You'll have a development version that has RSpec or whatever you want to run, and we'll get that fixed. So the sort of local testing story is kind of sketchy right now because there's so few people working on it. But yes, you should be able to run all your tests as long as they're running inside a servlet container. Right? So let's say you create your tests and they actually end up being servlets, and, then it will function without any effort. But your tests right now aren't servlets, right? So there's a teeny bit of work there, but it's not insurmountable. There was a hack fest at RailsConf, and Ryan Brown, who does all the heavy lifting on this, I believe got it working, but yeah, we need some more work there.
So you have plans for like a test version of the data store that can just be loaded like a gem and it would operate, make the APIs work and test without the...
Well, right. So like I described earlier, there's an advantage to not building any of this plumbing, but
right.
Instead just
the API changes.
Just use whatever the Java AppEngine folks release and run inside a servlet. It's possible that we could create a gem that has hooks that we need to do whatever we need to do.
A servlet that takes connections and passes them.
Right. But it's not a huge challenge. Just that there's no one else working on that right now. Okay, so let's take a look at publishing an app. And I have not a whole lot of time. So let me just throw a few things out. I could show you that, and maybe I don't even need to show you because it's so simple. I could basically create a new app ID called pivotal-test, publish an app there, and it would run. I'm not sure how exciting that is, but it's really not that hard to do. You'll find that when you build that kind of an app, you're going to be limited by this spin-up that you experience, this 12 seconds or so. But as long as you have some traffic, that instance will stay live. And a year ago, people would maybe ping periodically to keep one alive, and that's certainly interesting if you want to have demoware, but as soon as you go to that second instance, people would start piling up behind it. Now, that second instance comes up in the background and comes live. So even if you have no, what was I showing here? As long as, if you have no instances that are reserved, or I guess they call it always on, you have 3 application instances that are always sitting there, your app will still allow you to spin up new instances in the background. The problem is, if you have no traffic and you have 0 instances, the first person waits 12 seconds or whatever, that's fine. Now, the prediction of when to spin up a new instance has only one instance to work with. So it's kind of an uncomfortable situation. But if you have 3 instances all of a sudden taking a spike in traffic, those 3 instances can handle the spike until that 4th instance is ready. So if you're worried about scaling your app, just pay for the always-on feature, and 4 through n will be available in the background. Do you have any other questions?
I have another question.
Yeah.
How compatible is the API for like background jobs and tasks with like something like Rescue? I'm thinking about sort of like the lock-in effect of writing all your tasks to be like AppEngine compliant. Do you have any plans to let your task manager handle like a more traditional Rails style background job format?
Well, that's not something I'm working on, and there's a lot of effort going into making sure that new APIs, there's this Comet API, channel API, there's a lot of work going into making sure that new interesting APIs, the Blobster API and image manipulation, that those are available to AppEngine for Java. And then the JRuby folks, they can use those APIs, but there's definitely a need for some tooling and some gems to work with that. But I don't think it's the kind of thing where you have to build something totally specific. Like you might have a paperclip gem that also works on AppEngine. Maybe it's the JRuby paperclip gem that knows how to work with AppEngine. And so you just use a paperclip API, for example. But there's certainly work that you could do. That's also part of testing, I think, too, that we need to
I think it's a little distinct from testing. I think if you have a request, right, that comes in, you want to start some job, you don't want it to be in process in your request. If you have some framework that's like, okay, well, here's some work I need to do and go and schedule it, right?
So there was a demo at Google I/O last year that Max Ross did, where he shows an application loaded on production and it runs the test suite on production. So you basically have your app running, it creates a clone of all your data and partitions it inside of a special namespace, and then runs the tests on it and can clean up. And so you don't corrupt your live production data.
Well, I'm not talking about tests. This is a totally different thing. I'm talking about like actual background jobs that someone creates a new user and you need to generate an SSH key or something, right? And you don't want to do that in process in the request. It's like a traditional background job thing, right? So at some point you need to be able to say in a request, okay, this is a work that needs to happen, but I can't do it now.
Right.
And you put it in a queue. And then there's some code that you have somewhere else that goes and does it, right? And there's sort of like, in the Ruby world we have a couple of traditional ways that we do that, and tools that help us do that. And I'm interested in whether the way that you do that on AppEngine is similar enough to the way you do it everywhere else that you don't wind up with a huge switching cost if you want to go either way.
Right. Well, the task queue certainly is unique on AppEngine, but as long as you have the always-on feature, those tasks should hit warm instances. You don't want your tasks to go and be spinning up these new instances. That would be very inefficient. So that's the challenge you're going to hit. If you have a task queue where you're writing the whole thing in Python, it can just execute code and run it without this spin up.
So tasks are like in the form of requests that hit your app again?
Right. Tasks, you can basically have a task finish and call another task and run through the queue and run. It's something that you need to take a look at, and if you have questions, put them on the list. There might be someone else who's already done it. I think that there's actually a few people that have production apps that they haven't posted these issues because they just kind of got in and it seemed to work. But I find that a lot of times people do assume that it's never been done before, it's just that no one's actually posting. Yeah, there's a question back here.
Yeah, as far as getting your data out, what formats can you get it out in?
Right. So your data is there's these Python tools and there's this API that pull the data out in its own format. And I haven't specifically looked at what that format is, in that you can pull it out of the app and push it into a different app. So you can push it from one app to another. You can obviously create a whole, some sort of API that serializes everything as a YAML file or whatever you want to do. It's something that's an option. You could also look at the way the remote API functions and just basically use it and do a conversion in process to spit out whatever you want. The challenge is, what are you going to put it into? If you're going to try to write something that takes a denormalized set of data and puts it in SQL, that's going to be problematic. Yes?
So I hear a lot of questions about getting your apps out of AppEngine. It seems like it would be very difficult to take an app excuse me, that was written for AppEngine and move it to Heroku, for example, or move it to EngineYard or Rackspace. Why should we trust you guys to host our applications if we're going to be so tied into these APIs that are not replicated anywhere else?
Right. Well, if you have the SQL backend that will be available, you should be able to just take your app off Heroku and throw on AppEngine and it just runs, right? It's the data store that's quite unique.
Well, it's all the APIs. It's not
And all the APIs. So, right. So in this case, I could use the login API or whatever, and it just kind of handled for me, where I'd have to probably create that myself. So AppEngine is doing a lot of things for you. You might find that you have a bunch of apps in Heroku, and they're great, but you have one app that you need your database to scale better, and you do a test on AppEngine, you find that for what AppEngine gives you, it's more limited, but it is exactly what you need. Hopefully that's the case. You don't try to take apps that work perfectly on Heroku with the relational database and try to beat on them and to make them work on AppEngine. That will not lead to happiness. Okay, so any other questions? Okay, so like I said, the newest API is the one that has this always-on feature. So it's pretty much the way it's, the development process is very similar to what it was before, although now you can reserve these 3 instances to be on always, and scaling of new Rails apps works for you. I have actually found that I'll take apps, like I have old Rails 1.2.3 apps, and I just generate a new Rails app like I showed you, copy over, do some fiddling around, convert my models from Active Record to Data Mapper, and they just work. You know, I have a lot of apps that are pulling data and representing it. You know, there's not a lot of work there. The other thing that I could show you real quickly is the other advantage that you have on AppEngine, I need to bring this down, is you're running inside of JRuby. So if I show this app here, did I reload it here? So I have this scaffold that I've generated that's actually not running in Rails at all. It's running in this Mira dubious language that looks like Rails, but it compiles to a servlet, and then I can build the app in Rails, and I find that it's not especially efficient. I can then recreate that one URL as a Java servlet, basically, and then it's incredibly efficient, as in 10 times more efficient, or in some cases 100 times more, depending on what it's trying to do, and it doesn't have a spin-up cost. So I don't have the, so I'm going to try to create some logs here. So I have this app that I'm spinning up here. Okay. So let's look at the logs here. So,
Click on search, maybe?
well, no, I've got the logs. So I was actually doing this load here, Rails Annex. I'm pulling up a okay. So I was pulling up Associates 501, and it's 22 milliseconds, 13 milliseconds, 13 milliseconds, 30 milliseconds. That's a servlet that's written in this Mira dubious language. And if I go to contacts, it's going to take 15 seconds. This is an app that's just not spinning up. So what I just showed you was I hit the URL. The app doesn't need to initialize at all. It just takes less than a second or around a second to come up and respond. And now I'm going through the Rails stack for the first time. So it's taking 15 seconds or so to initialize, and there it is. And then I'm going to reload this a bunch of times. I'm just hitting reload. And then let's take a look at the logs there. So, contacts. Well, that's actually, I need some more logs here. So you saw the initialization cost of it spinning up. 60 milliseconds, 192 milliseconds, 250 milliseconds. So you can build an app in Rails and be very agile about developing it, put it in production, and then realize there's these two URLs that are extremely inefficient because they're doing all this work. You can then refactor those as these servlets, and then there's not a whole huge cost of spending 15 seconds to initialize a new app. It just initializes in a second, and there's no CPU cost, so you're not getting charged for it. And you might find that your app actually can be refactored into a few static pages with some AJAX and these JSON spitting out your data and not even go through the Rails stack. Although your app originally was a Rails app and you're just peeling off URLs one at a time in order to get efficiency. Yeah?
Does the Mira servlet go through Rack at all?
It doesn't go through Rack at all. And
so you couldn't mount like a Mira app and get the performance benefits in like your Rack app box?
Well, going through Rack is a JRuby thing. So JRuby takes 8 seconds to initialize, and Rails takes 8 seconds. And Mira is it's basically just a.
Mira's written in Dewey?
Mira is Doobie.
It's the same name.
So Mira is renamed. We used to be Doobie. So the app, I'm going to take a look at this app here. So the controller that I was showing you for contacts is a generated scaffold from Rails. I imagine everyone knows what that looks like. The Mira version of that looks like this. It is trying to be familiar, and then at the bottom, I specify all of the methods that I want to have available to render templates, and when I compile it, it compiles to this. So the source files look like, and here's actually my new template. It's doing a bunch of string appends, and down at the bottom is the wrapper, the main wrapper that puts the style sheet tags in and yields the body. So I have files that look like controllers and views and models, but they compile to servlets, and the source files don't look that different. And then I basically use Rails. Actually, what I often will do is I'll build a Rails app, I'll put it up, and then I want the user-facing views to be very fast, and so I recreate those as Mira servlets. But all the admin pages I just leave as Rails because I use those infrequently. And that's a different topic. The biggest challenge with doing Mira and Dubious is that Mira is changing rapidly, and so getting everything together that it works properly is a little bit tricky. But as I showed you in the logs, there's an incredible savings that you have available to you because you're running inside of Java to, at any point, replace some small piece with a Java servlet. And you can write that as Java, or you can write it in this Mira. And the views, by the way, here's the contact version. The views look very similar to your other ERB template. The difference here, I have to have a formatter for dates. But if you didn't know this wasn't Ruby, I don't think at a glance you would notice that it's different. And the model is here.
Do you know if anyone's trying to rewrite Rack in Mira?
Well, I don't think you need Rack because Mira, so the framework is called Dubious, is trying to basically create something that looks just like Rails, but doesn't do very much. It does the things that you do 90% of the time and nothing else. You wouldn't really need Rack because you're basically inside a servlet. So Mira knows how to talk to the servlet container, or Dubious does, and so that's really what it should be doing, I think. You certainly could. You could try to recreate Rack. I mean, I suppose there's an opportunity to recreate Rack so that you can have Rack as Mira and then talk to Rails through it, but I think there's a challenge there that you're actually talking from Java to JRuby instead of Rack being something that's inside of a JRuby runtime, right? Because Rack is a Ruby thing, right? Yes?
Is there a clear path then from Ruby source code to Mira code to this compiled?
So this is the Mira model for this contacts app, and you'll see that I have, what's that?
Is it generated from Ruby or you write this through?
Well, we have some generators. We have model generators and the control generators. The scaffold generator stuff I don't think is written yet, but this is the Mira version of the model, and the data mapper version is similar. You'll notice we don't have the required yet available, although that will come soon. And then timestamps at, I don't have a macro for that yet, so instead I do this, which is functionally doing the same thing. You also notice that there's nothing built into the framework that converts strings to dates and dates to strings. Ruby does this kind of magically for us, but in this case I have to decide I'm going to use a JavaScript format date because I have my date picker is a jQuery date picker, so I need to override that conversion.
But is this generated or no?
This isn't generated right now, but it is. It's a sample application that you just kind of copy and paste. I mean, you pretty much. Yeah. I don't think we have the generators that will generate this yet, although we certainly will write them. I do think that there's a problem of getting too far ahead of where the language and the framework is. It'd be nice to say, if you check it out, here's actually how you create a working application. And someone could create generators, or if you look at the source here, you might notice that I have there's probably other more important things to work on right now, like sessions, getting sessions working properly. Yeah.
Is there an easy way to import or convert a data set in order to normalize the SQL form, bring it into AppEngine for an existing app?
Yeah, so here's my take on that. I have apps that I've built on a relational database, and I keep piling on associations. They live for years, and I keep adding more and more associations. And I don't have to worry about how has many belongs to many works. I just create those associations, and I create a join table whenever I want. On AppEngine, you don't create that join table. Instead, you might say, I have people and I have products. And then I make a decision. There's going to be an array of IDs on one side or the other. And then if I'm writing your preferences of your products, I'll store an array on the person object. And then I can say, give me all the people that have project 5, 7, or 9. And I can query that. And that's how I do the has many belongs to many. So I have to make a choice on which side do I bolt this join table. I have an array inside of the model. And that's actually nice as a list type. So I might do the same thing with a search. I might decide to take some text field, split it on space, and store it as an array of strings. And I can say, give me back all the records that are Fred or Bob or Joe, and it'll return those records. You can't normally do that with SQL.
This is like design, but is there a tool? There's no tool.
Well, I think you would write your own tool. I think you might decide. Right, you might decide that the best way is to build one app that does one kind of thing, and a separate app and an API that they synchronize, or build two. You make choices about the kinds of things that are fast and easy, and then other things that are not possible or really difficult. Where a relational database, you just create new associations and everything's equally costly, right? In AppEngine, no matter how large your data set, your queries always return at the same time. And there's never any kind of task to add columns or whatever. You just throw new attributes in, new properties, whatever you want. Yes?
What is the level of commitment of Google of working on having really good support for Ruby on AppEngine? Like how many people are involved besides you?
Well, Google's commitment is to making sure that there are always new APIs and features available for Java AppEngine. And I build apps internally now exclusively Rails apps with some Mirror in them. And for the things I need to do, it works just fine. I can generate a Rails app, I can build an app. It's not full featured necessarily, but for what the work I need to do, it's perfect. So I put in whatever features I need to do the work I need. I'm not doing anything with Rails 3 yet, so no one's working on it. But there is no task force right now of people working on stuff. But the idea is, as long as you can run in development in the servlet container, the Ruby community can go do whatever they need to do, and they don't need anything from Google. There's nothing you can do in Java AppEngine that you can't do inside of JRuby because you're running inside of servlet just like Java. The big challenge before was if you had to initialize all of Rails and let your users experience that 12 seconds, that was a showstopper for people. So people weren't interested. Now it's totally doable. You just need to be willing to pay a minimal fee in order to keep 3 instances.
And can you give an example of cost of like, a medium traffic app running some instances?
Yeah, so I'm not the best person to answer that because my apps, I don't need to build them. I can build apps with enough edits and billing. I would say that if you have an app that uses a key value store, I would be amazed if you could find someplace else to serve that app for less, because AppEngine is very specific in what it provides, and if it does what you need, it's going to be much more cost-effective than building the same thing out on Amazon. Okay, thank you.